Kennedy.
Thank you very much. I very much appreciate the forum, and I salute your persistence in pushing this this conference forward despite the catastrophe that we've all been facing over the past year. So thank you very much. And again, I applaud your efforts. I'm going to spend a few moments talking about the race question and freedom of expression. Racial conflict intrudes on every aspect of American life, from the most private to the most public: sex, marriage, parenthood, jury service, the administration of criminal justice, voting. It also intrudes on our ideas regarding freedom of expression, boundaries, repression, education. Again, the race question is everywhere in American life. And I'm going to focus on 4 episodes in which racial conflict has played a major role in the development of our thinking with respect to freedom of expression and its limits. First episode, the long era of slavery. And here I would like to bring to our attention a statement made by the most eloquent fugitive slave in world history, the great Frederick Douglass, who once declared that, quote, "slavery cannot tolerate free speech." I'll repeat, slavery cannot tolerate free speech. Among its many evils, slavery imposed upon the United States of America the most intensive repression of conscience, thought, and speech that the country has endured. African Americans were the principal victims of this repression. Defenders of the slave power enacted laws that attempted to impose compelled ignorance upon slaves, depriving them of the means by which humans develop an informed understanding of the world and learn to express themselves. These laws sought to moot more familiar modes of censorship by preventing slaves from acquiring the means for reading or writing anything that slave masters would find objectionable. These laws attempted to cage the African American mind, limiting its development to capacities useful only for the purpose of serving masters. Noting that permitting slaves to write may be attended with great inconveniences, the South Carolina legislature enacted a law in 1740 that fined any person who shall hereafter teach or cause any slave or slaves to be taught to write. Acknowledging that the law had proven insufficient for keeping slaves, free Negroes, mulattoes, and mestizos in due subordination, the South Carolina legislature revisited the issue in 1800. This time, it prohibited African Americans, even in company with white persons, from meeting together and assembling for the purpose of mental instruction or religious worship, either before the rising of the sun or after the going down of the same. 34 years later, the South Carolina legislature returned again to this subject, making it a crime to teach a slave to read or write. South Carolina was not alone. Maybe I sort of pick South Carolina because that's my home state. I'm from South Carolina, but South Carolina was not alone. Listen to the Virginia House of Delegates in 1832, quote, "We have, as far as possible, closed every avenue by which light can enter the slaves' minds. If we could extinguish the capacity to see the light, our work would be completed. They would then be on a level with beasts of the field, and we should be safe." Contrast that to James Madison, who wrote, "The diffusion of knowledge is the only guardian of true liberty." But the Virginia House of Delegates had something else very much in store for slaves. Now, Despite the dangers involved, there were some slaves who persisted in trying to gain education. As Professor Heather Andrea Williams shows in Self-Taught, African-American Education in Slavery and Freedom, Blacks of all sorts, enslaved as well as free, tried to become literate. They did all sorts of things to try to gain access to knowledge. Some learned how to read, closely observing and listening to whites. Some dug holes in forests to create pit schools where slaves with some learning would share what they knew with other slaves. Still others took a calculated risk of bartering with whites. One slave traded boxing and wrestling lessons for writing instruction, and it goes on. But I'm going to take a turn here and focus on the way in which the slave regime not only repressed African Americans, but repressed whites as well. A baleful effect of slavery was seen in the academic and more general intellectual life of the nation, particularly the South. Prior to the pressure exerted by abolitionism from 1830 onwards, prior to the early 19th century, in the South, aristocrats with liberal views, Jeffersonians, were permitted to criticize slavery and then discuss slavery quite openly. In Kentucky in 1792, David Rice published the pamphlet, Slavery Inconsistent with Justice and Good Policy. In Virginia in 1796, St. George Tucker, the influential professor of law at William and Mary, published a dissertation on slavery with a proposal for the gradual abolition of it. In 1829, Dr. Thomas Cooper, president of South Carolina College, wrote a pamphlet entitled The Right of Free Discussion, in which he maintained that discussion about slavery should have no limits. But then, when abolitionism became a force, the authorities in the slave states cracked down on deviations from pro-slavery orthodoxy and no longer permitted free discussion. A moment ago, I mentioned that the president of South Carolina College wrote a pamphlet entitled The Right of Free Discussion. Well, subsequently, mirroring the ideological obsession that gripped the region, he changed course, insisting that any opinion drawing into question the rightness of slavery ought not be tolerated. In the slave states, particularly on college campuses, there was basically a blockade, an intellectual blockade. And if you were a critic of slavery, you kept it to yourself, because if you did not keep it to yourself, the proponents of slavery made life very hard for you. Consider the case of the chemistry professor, Benjamin Sherwood Hedrick at the University of North Carolina. It got out that Hedrick was sympathetic to free soiler principles. When word got out that he had some sympathy for free soilers, and the Raleigh Standard, local paper, published an editorial saying, quote, "The expression of Black Republican opinion in our midst is incompatible with our honor and safety as a people. Let our schools and seminaries of learning be scrutinized, and if Black Republicans be found in them, let them be driven out." Hedrick was burned in effigy by the students on campus. The faculty passed a resolution censuring him. He got his hat, he left. And that story was told in various ways over the course of in many campuses in the antebellum period. And the repression took all sorts of different guises. Southern students were discouraged from going north. The fear was that if they went to northern schools, they would become infected with alien anti-slavery ideas. There was an effort to encourage Southerners to go to Southern schools. The University of Mississippi owes its origin to this idea. Governor Albert Gallatin Brown declared in 1844 that a university in the state was necessary precisely to avoid sending Mississippi's youth to the North, where they would be subjected to noxious, infectious, anti-slavery ideas. In the South, there became a real attentiveness to texts from the North, a real effort to look over any and everything that people might read in the South to make sure that bad ideas would not filter into the slavery territory. So I'll end there. What was the importance of this? This was quite important because the attack on freedom of speech, the attack on freedom of conscience, the attack on freedom of thought prompted a counter-mobilization. I mentioned a moment ago the idea of the Free Soil Party, the party that was, that was one of the tributaries to the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. What was its slogan? Its slogan was free soil, free speech, free labor, free men. Free speech. There were a good number of people who were actually pushed towards anti-slavery ideas because they were appalled at the repressiveness of the slavery regime. And a good number of these people remembered the repression of the slave power. And when Reconstruction came around, there was an effort to put new limits on state power, in part because of what had been done against anti-slavery folk in the antebellum era. Let me go to a second episode. The second episode is the context in which Blacks emerge as censors, or at least would-be censors. During the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries in the United States, in, well, what is now the United States, African Americans were so bereft of power that the prospect of them suppressing speech to which they objected was really rather fanciful. They were on the receiving end of governmental and private repression, struggling desperately to defend the small spaces within which they could raise their voices. But they didn't have the wherewithal to censor racist expression, no matter how threatening or demeaning. Hence, prior to the 20th century, there is a vanishingly thin record of African Americans acting as censors. In the 20th century, however, that changes. And Blacks did try to silence propagators of racist ridicule, group vilification, and bigoted threats. An outstanding example of this occurs in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. I'm going to focus on the effort to suppress the play The Klansman and the film Birth of a Nation. The Klansman, the play The Klansman, was written by Thomas Dixon, a minister, lawyer, and writer passionately committed, in his view, to correcting the historical record regarding Reconstruction. A thoroughgoing Negrophobe, Dixon maintained that after the Civil War, the white South had been cruelly mistreated by Blacks who were racially unfit to participate in government, and by unscrupulous white scallywags and carpetbaggers who selfishly manipulated the former slaves. So the Klansman, this play of his, drew upon two of his novels. One was The Leopard Spots, a romance of the white man's burden, 1865 to 1900. And the other was The Klansman, a historical romance of the Ku Klux Klan. Both of these novels portrayed Black men as sexually aggressive brutes who lusted after white women and as irresponsible, corrupt ignoramuses who, inserting themselves into state legislatures through skullduggery, despoiled local government. In both novels, the heroes are Ku Klux Klansmen who defend white women from rape and redeem governance from the degradation of African American dominance. Now, the play received wildly divergent receptions. In some places, it was, you can well imagine, it was it drew large, appreciative white audiences. In some places, there were whites who were against it, not so much because they objected to its racial message, but they just thought that it was just going to cause a lot of trouble, and they just wanted to avoid discord. The people who were mainly the sort of the largest group of people who wanted to really censor the film, censored the play, were African Americans who objected to it. So, for instance, thousands of Blacks in Philadelphia protested at a theater where the play was scheduled to be performed. And they succeeded in actually getting the play suppressed in Philadelphia and in other places as well. In 1915, D.W. Griffith transformed Dixon's play into a motion picture, one of the most famous motion pictures in American film history, the landmark film Birth of a Nation. Now, all of the leading Black racial justice activists of the period urged public authorities to ban the film Birth of a Nation. James Weldon Johnson decried Birth of a Nation as a hell-inspired production, a stupendous moving picture play that seriously attempts to hold the American Negro up before the whole country as a degraded brute, and further to make him the object of prejudice and hatred. James Weldon Johnson's view was held, like I said, by almost uniformly among Black intellectuals of the period. W.E.B. Du Bois, the outstanding Black intellectual of the 20th century, also supported banning Birth of a Nation. He was ambivalent about it. I mean, after all, he was a writer, wrote in various genres, and was also very attentive to questions of freedom of expression. But ultimately, Du Bois, like I said, along with virtually all the rest of the leading Black intellectuals of the time, appealed to the National Censorship Board, appealed to local censorship boards, appealed to chiefs of police, appealed to mayors, governors, judges, legislatures to censor Birth of a Nation. What was the ultimate upshot? The ultimate upshot did not succeed. They succeeded some places. There were some places that they were successful in getting officials to ban the film, but most places they were unsuccessful. Let me go to a third episode, the Civil Rights era, the era of the Second Reconstruction, the period between approximately 1950 and 1970. This period saw, with respect to race matters, saw two really quite remarkable things happen. On the one hand, there was a remarkable change in race relations law. This was the period that saw the invalidation of segregation. Prior to the 1950s, racial segregation was viewed as a mere, innocent racial distinction. in the 1950s, Brown versus Board of Education, other cases, the law changed. Federal constitutional law changed, and this racial distinction was now viewed as an invidious racial discrimination and made unconstitutional. That was one of the big achievements of the period between 1950 and 1970. Another achievement was the attack on so-called private racial discrimination. See, for instance, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that prohibits racial discrimination in much of the private employment market, prohibits racial discrimination in much of the markets for public so-called privately owned public accommodations. Civil Rights Act of 1968 imposes regulation on housing transactions, private housing transaction. That was the second great achievement in terms of race relations law. The third great achievement in terms of race relations law in that period was the attack on racial disfranchisement. See, for instance, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Right alongside those achievements, however, were achievements with respect to civil liberties. So, I mean, the period between 1950 and 1970 was one of the great blossomings of libertarian case law in America. Give you a few examples. I mean, the whole idea of organizational privacy. Where does it begin? The idea that people should be able to join together, create organizations, and be free of the intimidation that might come from public revelation. Where does that come from? Well, the key case, NAACP versus Alabama. The state of Alabama tried to crush the NAACP by getting a hold of its membership lists and publicizing who was a member of the NAACP, so that these people could be ostracized, so that these people could be run out of town, so these people could be intimidated. Supreme Court of the United States created legal doctrine to protect the NAACP. What else? Well, the idea of litigation, lawsuits as a form of political activity, the idea of lawyering having a degree of First Amendment protection. Key case, NAACP versus Button. People in Virginia tried to crush the NAACP's attorneys. The Supreme Court created doctrine to give some shielding to these attorneys. Libel law. Lately, we've been hearing a lot about libel law. What's the key case with respect to libel law? New York Times versus Sullivan. It's the civil rights case. The allies of Martin Luther King Jr. put an advertisement paid for an advertisement in the New York Times. Segregationists in Alabama attacked the New York Times, said that the New York Times had libeled them. The Supreme Court created new doctrine to protect news media and others when they discuss public figures. For our purposes, and that's all of a backdrop, for our purposes, for any discussion of freedom of speech and higher education, it should be known, though it is not well known, it should be known that it was precisely in this period, in struggles against racial injustice, that the federal courts, for the first time in American history, provided federal constitutional rights to students at public universities. The key case, the seminal case, is a case called St. John Dixon versus Alabama State Board of Education. Quickly, what happened in that case was some Black students at Alabama State College engaged in a sit-in to protest segregation at a lunch counter that was located in a courthouse. The governor of the state learns about this. The governor of the state calls up the president of all Black Alabama State College and says, hey, listen, basically, I want you to expel these students. And that's what happens. I mean, the governor says to the president of the college, expel the students or else. The president of the college expels the students summarily. No hearing, no nothing, just summarily. The students get lawyers, and initially they lose because up to then, the law was basically, you're a student, you don't have a right. You don't have any rights really. In this case, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, for the first time in American history, said, you know what? Now, students have some right. I mean, students have a right at least to a hearing. You can't just summarily throw them out of a public university. They have at least a right to a hearing. That was the beginning of federal constitutional rights for students. After that, there was a case just a few years later. Actually, it involves some high school students in Mississippi. Black high school students go to school wearing a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee button on their clothes. White hand and a black hand shaking hands on the button with SNCC on the button. Principal of the school says, take the button off or leave. The students leave, they get lawyers. What do the lawyers say? The lawyers, again, Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, the lawyers say, well, the students weren't, there's no evidence the students were doing anything that was disrupting education. They weren't doing anything that was undercutting discipline. They have a right to speak to the extent that they don't undercut discipline at the school. A few years later, there was a Supreme Court case, Tinker versus Des Moines School District, in which the Supreme Court said that school, when you go into the schoolhouse, you don't lose your constitutional rights. So people now know of the Tinker case as the case in which the Supreme Court granted First Amendment rights to some extent to students. But that was presaged by the actions taken by Black students a few years before in the Deep South. Now, just a couple more points about this third episode. Just like in the slavery era, the repression, the segregationist repression was felt very much by Blacks. It was felt more widely. There were white folks who felt who also suffered from this repression. I think of James Silver at the University of Mississippi. James Silver wrote a book called The Closed Society, in which he talked about how white professors at the University of Mississippi, if they were against segregation, they had to keep it to themselves. And if they didn't keep it to themselves, they were forced out. That happened to students, that happened to faculty members. Segregationist repression had a multiracial cast of victims. One last point, and then I'll move to my fourth episode, Our Time. It's noteworthy that in the 1960s, this era of tremendous era of anti-racist activism, there was no major effort on the part of any of the civil rights forces, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress of Racial Equality, the Black Panther Party. No substantial effort to shut down racist speech. It's an interesting thing. Maybe, in question and answer, we can sort of go into that a little bit more. The Ku Klux Klan was around, but you don't see in that period a demand for the repression of the Ku Klux Klan by these organizations and other social racial justice activists. Similarly, on campuses, you don't hear that. I'll just note that for now. Let me turn to my fourth episode, our moment. And when I say our moment, I'm really talking about the period of time that during which, as a consistent matter, activists championing racial justice have argued in favor of repressing what they view as racist speech, thereby turning against notions that had become established features of the freedom of expression ideology that became ascendant in the 1960s. I'm talking in our moment, the past several decades, there really has been a consistent tension, sometimes a quite bitter tension, between champions of civil liberties and champions of civil rights. Is there a outstanding landmark for the beginning of this period? No, I don't know of an outstanding landmark. I did come across this in preparation for our discussion. In December 1974, one encounters the following statement in the report of the Committee on Freedom of Expression at Yale, sometimes known as the Woodward Report, in recognition of its chair, the esteemed historian C. Van Woodward. The committee decried, quote, signs of declining commitment to the defense of freedom of expression in the university. This is 1974. The Woodward Report went on to say that a significant number of students and some faculty members appear to believe that when speakers are offensive to majority opinion, especially on such issues as war and race, it is permissible and even desirable to disrupt them. That was 1974. Okay. Later in the 1970s, I remember this because I was in school in the late 1970s. Disruption of that Shockley, the man who thought, he was sort of believed that, Black people were intellectually inferior to people of other races. Later, Herrnstein, I guess in the late 70s, early 80s. Then later in the 1980s, you have the proliferation of speech codes on college campuses. In our own time, disruptions, we're all familiar with them. Charles Murray disruption, Ben Shapiro, Laura Ingraham, that fella, Yiannopoulos, maybe I'm mispronouncing his name. There are other manifestations of conflict between, again, the champions of civil liberties and champions of racial justice. We see it, we see it actually quite frequently on campuses. And one of the things that nurtured this turning against sort of the conventional libertarians of the 1960s was one of the things that has really propelled that, certainly at the theoretical level, are writings by people I've known for decades, lawyers, law professors. Three have been particularly significant in this domain: Charles Lawrence, Mari Matsuda, Richard Delgado. They put themselves in the critical race theory camp. And actually, one of their more consequential interventions has been against conventional liberal notions of freedom of expression. They've challenged the conduct speech distinction. They've challenged the idea of, they've challenged various ideas and really put pressure on conventional notions of freedom of expression. And many of the, things that, many of the controversies that we have seen of late, if they have been justified by ideas that were articulated by Lawrence, Matsuda, Delgado. What are the incidents I have in mind? Again, I think that they're probably familiar, but just for the sake of clarity, a week ago, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, Georgetown University Law Center, some teachers are caught on tape talking, and one of the teachers says to the other teacher, "Gosh, I'm really, it bothers me that a substantial number of the students who are really having a tough time, who are not doing well, are minority students. And this bothers me. This really, and I hate to see this, but it's true." And this is caught on tape. Both teachers, well, one teacher is fired, one teacher resigns, because this was deemed to be a racist statement, and the dean of the law school apologizes, etc. That's an episode. Michigan, there was I was in the last year, I've been involved in a number of cases. Some of them involving lawsuits, involving the following scenario. A teacher reads from a court case, or a teacher reads from a transcript, or a teacher reads from a text, maybe it's a text by James Baldwin, in which the term nigger is in the text. Teacher reads this, an objection is made. The objection is that the teacher enunciating the infamous N-word, out loud is just, intolerable. And in the case I'm thinking of, with respect to this teacher at one of the universities in Michigan, teacher, tenured by the way, dismissed. Finally, just one more example, really caught my attention. I'm a very proud alumnus of Princeton University. This past summer, there was an open letter that was sent to the president and other, the powers that be at Princeton University, a letter signed by a couple of hundred faculty members with various complaints and various demands. One of the demands that really caught my attention was a demand for a committee that would that would sort of oversee faculty teaching, oversee faculty writing, oversee faculty research, to monitor it for racism. Now, those are just 3 examples. I'm sure that in this group, you could probably multiply that, many times over, but that's where we are. Now, I want to have discussion, so just bear with me for a few more minutes. I've been talking thus far in a descriptive voice. In the last few minutes I have with you, at least for my initial comments, I want to change my stance and speak in a normative, prescriptive voice. Because I have very strong feelings about this subject. I have very strong feelings about the position that we are in at this moment. And I think that we really do need to be very attentive to the threat to freedom of expression, to freedom of thought that is being posed by people who are, I think overwhelmingly well-intentioned champions of racial justice, but who in their desire to create racial justice, or at least more of it, are propounding ideas that it seems to me are bad in general, and especially bad for people in higher education. Now, I think it's going to take a lot to meet this challenge. And I think that the meeting of this challenge is going to require a somewhat different approach than many people with my ideological stance have. So, when people talk about freedom of expression, academic freedom, oftentimes there is an immediate resort to principles, sort of stentorian, broad, red line principles. And you have people saying things like, in America, we should not have restricted speech. We should not have, all ideas are equal. We should have complete laissez-faire. Now, the fact of the matter is, that's balderdash. There have always been, and there will always be, some restrictions on speech. Obscenity, pornography, libel, bribery, threats, incitement, fraud, blackmail, harassment at the workplace. One could go on. So, people who are champions of freedom of expression, I don't think do themselves any good by giving voice to ideas that are so easily pricked and so easily, you can just, what are you talking about? There's regulation. The question is, where do you want to draw lines? If Richard Delgado is right when he says, if an exception can be drawn for true threats, why cannot an exception be made for real racism? He's got a point. I think that people who want to protect freedom of expression should ditch the legalism, the resort to the overbroad statements, and actually become much more contextual, should become much more pragmatic. It's not a matter of no regulation versus regulation. There will be some regulation. The real issue is what the character of that regulation ought to be. Ought claims of racism to be a predicate for permitting the censoring or punishment of writing, teaching, or research? My answer is no. Why? For practical reasons. I don't think that actually suppressing, quote, racism will actually get the regulationists even what they want. I think it's bad policy, and it will be bad for the campaign for anti-racism, and it will be bad for those who want to protect freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom of expression on our campuses. I could say more, but why don't I stop there, and we can, go to various aspects of what I've said through questions, through comments, and by all means, through the expression of any objections to what I've said thus far. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for an extremely interesting speech. And we mean to now open the floor to discussion. That will happen in two phases. First, we'll open the discussion to questions from our panelists. And then after a proper amount of time, we'll open up to questions from the audience. Those in the audience, if they wish to ask questions, please use the Q&A function that you may see at the bottom of your screen. But as to the panelists, please use the raise hand function. Unfortunately, I've come to realize that the raise hand function is situated in different places on different people's screens for some reason. So for some, it's right there on the bottom tray, about the fifth item from the right. Others have to look in the they have to click on participants, and I think then it becomes available. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong about that. This will create, using the raised hand, will create a nice ordered list of people sequenced by who was first. And on that basis, I call on Professor Ulrich Baer.
Thank you so much. So thank you, Professor Kennedy. It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
And I really appreciate this talk where you go into antebellum history and sort of the kind of role that free speech has played for or against the protection and rights of minorities. And I want to go to the prescriptive part where you named the exceptions, which we all accept more or less, to free speech regulations on libel, et cetera, and you ended the list with saying harassment at the workplace. Mm-hmm. In some ways, historically, you could say that's the most recent one, about 30 years old. Catherine McKinnon shifted our understanding of harassment from speech, where someone just says a bunch of crude jokes, to equality, where someone is being targeted because they are in a protected group. So that's a relatively novel way of thinking. It's not a speech issue anymore, but an equality issue. Mm-hmm. It took about 35 years for that legal intervention to become a culturally accepted thing. And that leads to Me Too. And that now we think harassment in the workplace is not just telling a bunch of dirty jokes, but actually an equality issue. Mm-hmm. Since you say it would be bad policy to implement something like that, where running around and using racial slurs would create an unequal conditions in a workplace or a college, why is it bad policy to move into that area, whereas, which we all know, Catherine McKinnon's approach was criticized widely for 3.5 decades, but has now become somewhat accepted as a way to think about it, not as an exclusive speech issue, but an equality issue. So I'm just curious why this would be bad policy. And if we meet again in 30 years, we will look back at this and what would happen if actually racist speech would be treated in the same way in which workplace harassment is treated?
It's a wonderful question. I'll say two things. One, I will resist your proposition that the question of harassment is, sort of thoroughly accepted. There's a good amount of ambivalence. There's a substantial amount of question around that. So again, to go into my domain, a teacher is reading from a court opinion, sees the infamous N-word, enunciates it. A student says, that's bad. That's hurting my feelings. That's interfering with my ability to learn. Therefore, it is it is inequitable. It's treating me unequally. Now, it's harassment. You might say that's harassment. Now, frankly, in 30 years, it may very well be, depending on what happens. In 30 years, maybe that student who objects will be right in 30 years. Maybe in 30 years, it will be the view that that was harassment. In my view, in 30 years, I'll be pretty old in 30 years. I will look back and say, that's too bad. That was a mistake. I mean, frankly, it's not as if every change is a change for the better. And so I think we need to be very clear about, or we need to really question, harassment. What do we mean by harassment? I hear people talk about harassment, in certain contexts now, and frankly, I want to say no. I'm not going to. I don't think that's harassment. So, I want to put on the brakes and ask some more questions about what we're calling harassment, what we're calling, hate speech. Because frankly, some of the stuff that is now viewed as, quote, hate speech. No. I wrote a book that many people would say is hate speech. And I'm not, nope, I don't think it's hate speech. I'll defend the book and its title. Is that responsive?
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So next on the list is Bradley Jackson.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Kennedy, for a wonderful talk, and thank you to the organizers of the conference for bringing together a great group of people. I would like to ask a question about dignity, both as a kind of a principle of liberal politics and also as a kind of jurisprudential principle, potentially. So it seems to me pretty clear that dignity is a principle of liberal politics. If we had a government that was systematically denying dignity to groups of people, that would be wrong. And we should have mechanisms in the law to protect the dignity of people, at least from invasion by the government, if not laws to build up the dignity, at least to kind of protect it from disparagement, things of this nature. And we see some movement in the Supreme Court jurisprudence, the Obergefell decision, for example, to kind of use a standard of dignity in order to evaluate whether civil rights are being infringed upon or not. And I'm wondering if you could comment a bit on dignity as both a political and a jurisprudential principle, and discuss whether there might be any conflict between such a principle and the sort of civil liberties that you've been discussing throughout this talk, the right to freedom of expression and things of that nature. Thank you.
Yes. So there are people who, this is an imposition on my dignity to have to be in a class and hear the professor say this word or that. It's an imposition on my dignity to have to hear a classmate voice a theory which calls, my status into question, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that, people are saying that. I'm a pluralist. I want to, fine. I want to hear it. I want to be careful about the claim to dignity, because I've heard people sort of play the dignity card as if it was a trump that was supposed to stop the conversation. I want to hear somebody, somebody says, well, this is this is I view this, you're questioning my dignity. I want to be able to say, well, no, I'm not. I guess I want to be very careful about any of these arguments being a conversation stopper. And while I'm on it, let me say, again, one of the pragmatic reasons that I would urge, one of the things that is really concerning me about the campaign for, the sort of repression on behalf of racial justice is the effect that it is having on its putative beneficiaries. One of the arguments is this repression is actually reinforcing the dignity of marginalized people. I want to question that. Is it in fact, is it reinforcing the dignity of marginalized people? Or is it infantilizing marginalized people? Is it making people actually more dignified, as in stronger? Or is it weakening people? My sense is, frankly, that it's often weakening people, far from it reinforcing the dignity of people. I think it's actually undermining the dignity of people by telling them that they should feel heard. You should feel heard, whether you do or not. You should really feel heard. If people tell you enough that you should feel heard, lo and behold, you actually might start feeling heard. And then if you feel hurt, then you're going to start, complaining about feeling hurt and demanding that people stop hurting you. Far from strengthening, as far as I'm concerned, that chain is leading not up, but down. So yes, I want to be attentive to claims of dignity, but I also want to be attentive to ways in which claims of dignity might be counterproductive.
Thank you. Any rejoinder there, or should we move on? All right, then next in our queue is one Richard Zinman from Michigan State University.
Oh, he's on mute. He's muted.
You got to unmute yourself, Dick.
Thank you, Professor Kennedy, for a very thoughtful and thought-provoking talk. I am struck by the fact that you ended with an appeal to ditch legalism and embrace a more pragmatic approach to dealing with these issues, both of which sound like good advice to me. On the other hand, as you, in responding to questions, talk about the issues before us, it seems that something more than mere pragmatism is needed. And I wonder whether you think, for example, that a critique of something like critical race theory ought to be part of the agenda of people who have the same concerns as you do. I mean, I'm struck by the fact that so much of our discussions turn on exactly the examples you used. So, for example, the issue is almost always not whether someone is engaged in racist speech, but what exactly constitutes racist speech. Mm-hmm. The issue is not almost never whether someone is intentionally aiming to undermine the dignity of this or that person, but what constitutes dignity and what constitutes its undermining. And I wonder whether it's possible to treat such questions and think them through in a merely pragmatic way. Again, I'm all in favor of engaging in the most pragmatic approaches we can, but is something more than that needed? I mean, do you have to go to the roots of something like critical race theory, which after all makes possible, it's not the only source, but one of the things that makes possible the very notions of racism and dignity that you yourself call into question?
Yeah, okay. On the question of pragmatism, yeah, one has to have aims. One has to be able to answer the question, what are your ambitions? What do you ultimately want? So, I mean, one has to have, what do I ultimately want? I mean, there are reasons why we want people, there are reasons why I am in favor of a wide horizon for freedom of expression, whether it's, the feeling of actualization by a person, the idea that I mean, if we're talking about self-government, very essential. If we're talking about the accretion of knowledge, I mean, there are a whole bunch of different reasons why one would be in favor, and so one has to keep those things in mind. What sort of people do we want to build? What incentives do we want to have? What sort of characters, what sort of character do we want people to have? Do we want people to be Do we want to incentivize thin-skinnedness, or do we want to incentivize thick-skinnedness? I mean, so I agree with you that we need aims, we need principles, we need visions of the good society. What my idea was, and I think that in these discussions, there's a tendency to begin the discussion with, citing, well, my old boss, the great Thurgood Marshall, wrote an opinion in which he says something along the lines of, in American constitutional law, there's equality of ideas. And the government must treat all ideas the same. And it's quoted a million times. I think Mosley versus Chicago. It's quoted all the time. What? Please, not true. What about, again, what does one do about obscenity? What does one do? What does one do about are you going to tell me that the United States government is not going to act against a person who has in his, computer, all of the places where, all of the nuclear weapons that the United States has? This guy has them all and everybody knows it. And you know what? And he's going to be able to publish it? No. Why, but in a lot of our discussions, you will have people that will make these very broad arguments, overly broad. And I think that has been a very important part of why the sort of liberal, liberal legalism has, I think, suffered, because I think that people of various intellectual persuasions, whether it be Catherine McKinnon, whether it be Cass Sunstein, sort of civic republicanism stuff, whether it be Delgado, Matsuda, critical race theory. I mean, frankly, at a certain point, all of them are in a way just being realistic and are saying, no, actually, speech is hedged in. So since speech is hedged in, let's not pretend that it's not. It seems to me we've got to concede that it is, and then say, yeah, it is. But we don't want to hedge it in anymore. It's hedged, but we don't want to, not a step further, and be willing to defend on very concrete grounds, not highfalutin theoretical, but concrete. You say this is racist. Why do you say it's racist? It doesn't sound racist to me. If it is racist, with outlawing, do what you want it to do. I think a very fine book in this domain, I'll be right with you, hold it one second. A very fine book, published about 2 years ago, Nadine Strawson, Why We Should, it's called Hate. Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. I think it's a very fine book, but the beginning of her book, the first substantive chapter of the book, here's the title: Hate speech laws violate fundamental free speech and equality principles. That chapter is full of, the highfalutin Thurgood Marshall sort of, blowing of the trumpets talk. That's the weakest part of her book. The best part of her book is the later chapters. Because of their intractable vagueness and overbreadth, hate speech laws undermine free speech and equality. Now, she's getting the nitty gritty. Let's get with some facts. The next subject, next chapter. Is it possible to draft a hate speech law that is not unduly vague or overbroad? Next chapter, does constitutionally protected hate speech actually cause the feared harms? Again, it's when she's more pragmatic that she's better. And I'm simply saying, I share her values. I'm simply saying that people who do share those values should ditch the overbroad, legalistic stuff and embrace an argument that I think is more contextual, closer to the ground. One last comment, I don't mean to filibuster. Ultimately, this fight will be won or lost, not in the law courts, but in the court of public opinion. And so, because public opinion will determine the law. To get back to what Professor Bayer said early, a few minutes ago, the question of harassment, public opinion. 40 years ago, public opinion was in a very different place. You didn't have a law of harassment. Public opinion changed, and now we do. So it seems to me, for people who want to broaden the horizons for freedom of expression in general and on our campuses, become better at engaging with public opinion.
Thank you. I'm going to move to the first question from the larger audience, and I'll read this one out myself. It's written by a Shika Dalmia, who writes for The Week. And the question is this: when the majority's speech dominates and creates an unlivable environment, as the birth of a nation did for a racial and persecuted minority, would you be opposed to social movements that tried to drive this speech out of respectable company? Mm-hmm. Boycott of theaters that aired these views. So similarly, should Milo Yiannopoulos, the modern day Thomas Dixon Jr., whose Twitter brigade was a study in racial hatred and anti-Semitism, have been banned due to protests by social justice activists? Is Milo's ban not akin to Du Bois's wanting to get Birth of a Nation banned? Or would you consider both Milo's and the Birth of a Nation ban to be illicit silencing? Do the limits of social activism, are they the same as those of constitutional legal activism?
Mm-hmm. Great question. Thank you for it. I think that the struggle over Birth of a Nation is a really quite important episode. It has caused me a lot of trouble because, I said the leading Black intellectuals of the period appealed for the repression of Birth of a Nation. And I revere those intellectuals. You might not see it. I've got a t-shirt on with W.E.B. Du Bois. I walk around Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson. I revere them. They wanted the suppression of Birth of a Nation. 2 points here. One, is what they attempted to do, was what they attempted to do a good thing? Or was it counterproductive? The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was the main organization fighting to suppress Birth of a Nation. At the end of their campaign, which largely failed, they spoke internally. How do we judge what we've done? There were a substantial number of them who said, you know what, maybe we screwed up. Because actually, isn't it the case that through our efforts to ban Birth of a Nation, didn't we get them a lot of publicity? Didn't we actually make Birth of a Nation, more alluring to people? Didn't we alienate some people who might otherwise have been on our side? It's not at all clear that the effort to ban Birth of the Nation was a well taken instance of racial justice activism, notwithstanding the character of the people who were associated with that action, and they were great people. That's one thing. Second thing, you touch on an issue, when the question of what is censorship, I think, is an understudied issue. So I have friends. Professor Melzer, you talked about how in our present moment, one of the issues that's constantly come up on college campuses is disinvitations. Here, I must say, I've had many debates with my colleagues, some of my colleagues, about disinvitations, because I've heard people say, disinvitations is bad. That's censorship. And my response is, well, hold it. Why is a campaign of disinvitation censorship? Why is it that people banding together, expressing themselves, president of the university or the board of trustees invited so-and-so? They didn't ask me about it. They invited so-and-so. I don't like so-and-so. I'm appalled by so-and-so. And I'm gonna get together with my friends and we are publicly going to ask that the university disinvite so-and-so. Why isn't that just an exercise of freedom of speech? Why is that, quote, censorship? The question of what is censorship versus what is the expression of, freedom of speech, I think that's a vexed topic, and I think it's a good topic for debate.
Thank you. Next on our list is Professor Lee Jossam.
Well, again, like everybody else, thank you for all that. That was tremendous talk, incredibly thought-provoking and stuff. I'm going to make a comment and then get to my question. I wasn't going to make this comment, but I'm going to push back on your last point a little bit. I think it absolutely is censorship. You could argue that they are exercising their free speech in an act of censorship, or in an act of attempting to censor and prevent both the speaking and the hearing of the invited speaker. So in that sense, it's not legal censorship, but it absolutely is an attempt at social censorship. So that's my pushback on that. But I have a question for you. I have a question about something that has really vexed me. I think you and I will mostly share the values about this, that we want to, in general, err on the side of free speech, but it's not unlimited. That is ridiculous. You're sort of the poignant way in which you made the case that, of course, it's not unlimited. Nobody in their right mind would say it's unlimited, though it was really really well done. So this is my question for you. It was the final part of your main talk when you were talking about that. So it's like just a question of where we draw the lines and how we negotiate that. And so I'd like to give you a recent real world example that has vexed me. I don't know what I think about this. And so I want, not from a legal standpoint, but from your prescriptive standpoint, from your values standpoint, either what you think or how you would go about thinking about the purge of QAnon, Stop the Steal, conspiracy theorists from social media. It was a massive, massive purge. It was probably hundreds of thousands of accounts, possibly millions of accounts. It was all done by private companies that some people argue constitute the public square. So that's my question. Maybe you thought about it, and then I'd like, what have you thought about it? And if not, then how would you go about figuring out how to figure that out?
Okay, couple things. First, and this is related to the question that immediately preceded yours. Sometimes people speak of ostracism as if ostracism is necessarily a bad thing. It is not. I think it is good that there is ostracism of cruel ideas and people who do cruel things. I want cruel ideas and people who do cruel things to be ostracized. There is a social struggle going on over, cruelty and other sorts of malevolence. And those things ought to be ostracized. And I have no problem with that. One of the great achievements of the 20th century, or at least an achievement, I thought we were further down the road than we in fact are. I thought that racism had been ostracized more than it actually has been. My fault. I thought that, I've written about it. I thought that no ambitious national politician would stand to be viewed as just out and out racist. I thought, we turned the page on that. Well, naive me. It would be good, though. It would be good for it to be ostracized. Now, so social ostracism, we can debate what should be ostracized, what should not, but I have no problem with the idea that cruel, mean, destructive, conduct, ideas, should be ostracized. Now, here I must say, I'm about to say something. Well, do I draw a distinction between the social world, the world of social ostracism, and the world of state power? Yes, I do. So if everybody wants to turn their back on and cancel, so-and-so who's a racist, who says racist, they're fine. Ostracize them. Do I want the organized polity in the form of the state to punish that person, threaten that person, say you can't say that? No, I don't. Now that gets me to your third thing. What about private companies? What about a company, what about Facebook? What about Twitter? What about Google? In many ways, in many contexts, they're more powerful than the doggone government. I haven't figured that out. I mean, I'm not trying to be cute here. I'm not trying to, put you off. I'm caught here. I'm trying to figure it out, because on the one hand, yes, they are very powerful. On the other hand, Big Brother is still the force that we must, as far as I'm concerned, must be most careful about. And as between big tech, as between Google, Facebook, Twitter, them, and having Big Brother put the finger on them, now, I'll go with the market. Each way, I mean, there's going to be a problem. There's a problem whichever avenue you go down, but I guess, frankly, maybe Big Brother is still the most fearsome of the menaces out there. And so with that in mind, I'll stick with the ACLU on this and view Big Brother as the ultimate menace and do my calculations accordingly.
Thank you. Dustin, do you have a selection from the audience?
Yeah, did you want to get the remaining participant?
Well, let's, I don't know, let's just do a mix.
Okay. Yeah, so we have a few questions from the audience. Just start at the top. Mr. Kennedy, this is from Alexander Smithley, by the way. Mr. Kennedy, what are your thoughts on the idea regarding free speech that says that good ideas and good thought will rise to the top when we have more rather than less free speech? Proponents of a generally larger amount of free speech would say that we can sometimes allow the bad ideas to be said, then we can speak out about why they're incorrect, debate them, and defeat them, rather than censor them, which hurts the ideal of free speech. The bad ideas, they will be exposed. Conversely, the good ideas will rise to the top.
Sometimes good ideas rise to the tops and sometimes they don't. I don't think that, the history of the 20th, the history of the modern world shows us that very terrible ideas can triumph. The lie, what Goebbels was able to accomplish should give us a lot of doubt about the axiom that what good is going to triumph. No, not necessarily. No, I still believe, like your questioner, I think. I mean, I basically think that the way to go is more speech. I'm a more speech guy, but I'm a more speech guy not with the idea that more speech is necessarily going to win out. It's more speech because maybe this is the best we can do. Again, to go back to my earlier comment, I don't want to trust Big Brother with figuring out what's good and bad, and we want to hear from this one, but we don't want to hear from this one. So I don't want to put it in the hands of Big Brother. I don't want to put it in the hands of the dean. I mean, the students, I must say, I'm sort of mystified. I'll be talking with students. Students will be talking about, racism is so pervasive. Racism is so deep. Racism is, we got unconscious racism. And that's why I want to go. That's why I want the dean to put the kibosh on so-and-so. I'm saying, well, hold it. You were just, why do you trust the dean? Why do you trust Big Brother? I believe in more speech, not because better speech is necessarily going to win in the marketplace of ideas. I mean, the marketplace of ideas, perfectly horrible things win in the marketplace of ideas. But sometimes you can't do any better. Sometimes you're forced to, second best, third best, fourth best, fifth best. And I would say more speech is, that's where I put more speech.
Okay, then next on our panelist list is Zach Bennett, who teaches political theory here at MSU.
Thank you for your talk, Professor Kennedy. I found it very interesting, like everyone else. I wonder what your thoughts are on the cause or the causes of the shift in attitudes among opponents of racism from the third moment to the fourth moment that you described in your talk. You referred to some of the new ideas that have been embraced in our time, but I suppose what I'm interested in is what was it that made people receptive to those new ideas, especially since, as you noted, in the third moment, the civil rights era, there was uniformity or near uniformity against dealing with racism through restrictions on speech. So what caused the change and to shift from the descriptive to the prescriptive, to the extent that you think that's a wrong turn?
Yeah.
Why was it a wrong turn? Why was that the wrong response to whatever changed in conditions?
Great question. I'm not altogether sure. Here are a couple of speculations. One speculation is that people like the new. So in the 1960s, by the end of the 1960s, you really do, largely because of the American Civil Liberties Union, more than any single organization I can think of, you really do have the ascendancy of a type of, sort of ACLU ideology of freedom of expression. And it's riding high. It is one the judges over. I mean, think of the, it's absolutely extraordinary. Guy goes into a courthouse with a jacket on saying "fuck the draft," goes up to the Supreme Court, Justice Harlan of all people, leave this guy alone. One person's lyric is another what's good for one person is bad for another. You have this triumph, but nothing stays set. Nothing is going to just sort of be settled. And my sense is, and again, this is just a speculation. I think that attitude, that idea on the part of sort of the liberal left, it became the orthodoxy. And I think after a few years, younger people, want to rebel against whatever the heck is the orthodoxy. I think that's part of it. By the late 1960s, in fact, throughout the 1960s, the leading lawyers for the racial justice movement, I think of Thurgood Marshall. There has been no justice alive who was more of a classic civil libertarian than Thurgood Marshall. In the late 1940s, when there was a case, sort of idiosyncratic case, but case nonetheless, Beauharnais versus Illinois, case involving criminal prosecution for racial vilification. White guy, right racist, has these pamphlets that vilify Black people, is prosecuted convicted. Supreme Court of the United States, 5-4 opinion, affirms the conviction, says racial vilification can be it's prosecutable. The ACLU seeks to have the Supreme Court of the United States revisit that case. The ACLU reaches out to Thurgood Marshall at the NAACP and says, will you join us in asking the Supreme Court of the United States to review this, reconsider? What does Thurgood Marshall say? He says yes. Why does he say yes? He says yes because, I think he's a racial justice guy. This is Mr. Racial Justice. I think we, my folks, my NAACP, will do better in a legal environment that's totally open. Let these people go on and say what they want to say about Black people. Let them do it. We think we'll be better off in a environment where you're not prosecuting people for what they say. The other person, by the way, who was maybe even more militant on these issues than Thurgood Marshall was Robert Carter, General Counsel of the NAACP. And I mention these people because nowadays, sometimes you'll have people who'll say, they'll sort of say, well, white civil libertarians are willing to countenance the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazis, speaking, but that's because, well, what the hell, they're white. They're not on the receiving end of the burning cross or the N-word or the insignia or the swastika, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mentioned Thurgood Marshall advisedly. He was a person who knew very well, in the most intimate way, what racism was about. He took he opened, Robert Carter as well. And again, to get back to your point, I do think I say this to my students with whom I argue, because many students disagree with me on this. They talk about, they talk about fighting for racial justice, and and I say, yeah, I'm glad you're fighting. I'm with that fight too. There was nobody. John Lewis was with that fight too. Martin Luther King was with that fight too. Medgar Evers was with that fight too. These are people who knew racism. Why is it that their attitude with respect to these issues was so different? Which is your question. And frankly, again, just because ideas change doesn't mean that ideas are getting better. I think in certain ways that the racial justice camp has taken on certain ideas, certain sentiments, certain attitudes that actually represent a step back. I think that the racial justice champions of the 1960s showed a toughness that actually, in my view, is better, more admirable, more serviceable, more effective than some of what is being shown today.
I think we have time for, actually we're about 15 minutes over our time, but one last question, and let me call on Amna Khalid, a historian from Carleton College.
Professor Kennedy, that was delightful. It's refreshing to listen to you, as always. So I was thinking as you were talking about your proposal for us to be pragmatic, and I concur entirely. That speaks to me, and it makes a lot of sense. But as you said that, I was wondering, why is it that liberals have failed to be pragmatic? And it seems like something that should occur to us. And I think I found my answer in your response about the question that someone asked in the audience about, good ideas rising to the top. And it is perhaps, I think, a false faith in this idea, this assumption that good ideas will always rise to the top, which is what has prevented us from becoming pragmatic. There is an idealism that we have. And that idealism right now, I feel, we're in a moment when it's under threat, precisely because, and we're struggling because we don't, because we have this ill-placed faith in the inevitable victory of good ideas. And the moment I think it became clear to liberals was when Trump was elected. It was the sheer shock of that moment kind of captured that. So I wonder, how would you respond to this?
I think there's a lot to what you say. I do think that, or a different way of putting it is, a certain sort of sentimentality. I think that's part of it. I think there's a certain amount of complacency too. Again, to go back to my earlier thing, the people who struggled against various sorts of repression. I mean, I've been, in my talk, and we've been talking about race. It was also, in the 1950s and 1960s, there was also the whole, Red Scare, anti-communism. The people who struggled against that were struggling against something. Sometimes when you achieve what you're trying to get, when you, in a way, the ACLU view got on top. Well, you get on top and then there's a problem, complacency. And so, when you're struggling, that's one thing. But if you're on top, I think it's fairly easy for you to fall into certain bad habits. So, one bad habit is to, switch off the old thinking machine and simply, throw out a couple of precedents or cite the law. The law says this, as if the law is the end. It's not. It's not the end. 30 years, 40 years, change of personnel, you're going to have different law. So I think that complacency has been a problem. I think that the sentimentality. I don't want to, listen, we're dealing with issues about which, sensible people really differ. And, I think people are trying to really struggle with competing commitments. And in light of that struggle, we're gonna have to think real hard and dig real deep, and not in a sense, be willing to do different, new things. And I think that this confrontation that is going on now is going to require new thinking, maybe some new terminology, new strategies for trying to engage, new generations, new customers. So.
Okay, well, thank you very much for a truly fascinating talk, and thank all the questioners for their questions. I'm sorry we have to stop with a few hands raised, but we're not done yet. So please tune in again tomorrow, 11:30, when we'll get started again. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
So sorry about this.
Sorry.